Breaking news out of Rhode Island. A gunman is dead after several people were shot at an indoor ice skating rink. It happened this afternoon in Pawtucket. Investigators say in addition to the suspect, one of the victims is dead. 4 other people have been taken to the hospital. A hockey game between 2 high schools was reportedly happening at the time of this shooting. No other details have been released. Queen City News will continue to bring you updates on this developing situation as we learn more information.
Well, Tom, Marissa, this has all just happened in the last few hours. These are video from one of the helicopters over the scene here, and a press conference just wrapped up. The Pawtucket police chief just confirmed that 3 people are dead, including the suspect, and 3 others have been shot and are in the hospital right now. Now, CNN is also reporting that this is domestic in nature and that the gunman appears to have been targeting members of his own family. The police chief says it was just one family involved and that this was a targeted event potentially related to a family dispute. Now, the chief also reported that police were not involved and it appears that the suspect killed himself. According to investigators, this happened at the Dennis M. Lynch Arena in Pawtucket just before 3 p.m. this afternoon. According to our sister station WCVB, who just arrived on scene in the last hour or so, a high school hockey game was happening at the arena, and the arena is now closed off as this investigation continues. Our colleagues again have reporters on the scene, and they tell us that the parking lot was full with families and parents who were at the game at the time. All of this happening just 2 months after that deadly shooting on the Brown University campus. Let's listen in.
We want to speak to the families and make sure the families are well aware of what happened before we release any information. Again, we're still only at the initial stages. It only happened at 2:30 this afternoon. Again, we went in, like I said, there were several people in there. We have several witnesses that are at the station, so we're going to put together a story before we release information to make sure that the information put out there is accurate and correct.
That was the police chief there. They are trying to figure out all of this as this transpired in the last couple of hours. Now, the governor of Rhode Island posted on social media that he is monitoring the shooting. Again, 3 people are dead, including the shooter. As this story develops, we will bring you any updates.
It was supposed to be just another hockey game. Parents bundled up in their seats, coffee cups in hand, cheering for their kids the way parents do. Loud, proud, completely absorbed in the ordinary magic of watching their children play. Players on the ice, skates cutting clean lines across the rink. The familiar sounds of a youth hockey game filling the Dennis M. Lynch Arena in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. The crack of sticks, the scrape of blades, the boards rattling as players slammed into them with the full, uncomplicated energy of young people who had no idea what was about to happen in the stands above them. Nobody did. Not the parents, not the coaches, not the kids on the ice, who would spend the rest of their lives trying to unsee what they saw that day. Not the families sitting in the bleachers who came to watch a hockey game and instead witnessed something so violent, so sudden, so completely disconnected from the ordinary world of a Monday afternoon youth sporting event that the human brain struggles to process it even after the fact. One moment, the game, the next, gunfire. And in the chaos that followed, as players dove behind benches and scrambled for exits, and parents screamed for children whose names they could barely get out through the panic rising in their throats, 2 people were already dying in the stands. A woman named Rhonda Dorgan and her adult son, Aiden. The person who killed them was someone they had once called family, someone who had sat at their dinner table, someone who had watched Aiden grow up, someone who had walked into that arena on that Monday afternoon carrying 2 legally owned firearms and an intention that nobody in that building, not one of the nearly 100 witnesses who would later speak to investigators, had seen coming. His name was Robert Dorgan. He was 56 years old. He also went by the name Roberta. And by the time the gunfire stopped, by the time an unnamed Good Samaritan stepped out of the crowd and into the line of danger and did something that most people in that moment could not, Robert Dorgan was dead too. A self-inflicted gunshot wound, exactly as planned. 3 more people were rushed to hospital in critical condition. Rhonda's mother, Rhonda's father, a family friend who had simply come to watch a hockey game. Rhode Island was already grieving. Just 2 months earlier, a shooting at Brown University had shattered the state's sense of safety and left wounds that had barely begun to close. And now this. Gunfire at a children's hockey rink in a city a few miles from the state capital on an ordinary Monday afternoon. But this story is not just about a shooting. It is about everything that led to that Monday. The divorce, the history, the bitterness that had been building for years inside a family that, from the outside, looked like it had simply fallen apart the way families sometimes do. Quietly, legally, with paperwork and court dates, and the slow, painful untangling of a shared life. It is about what happens when that untangling is never really finished, when the anger never really goes away. And when a person walks into an ice arena with 2 guns and a plan, and the people they once loved have no idea it is coming. This is the story of what happened at the Dennis M. Lynch Arena in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. And it begins long before the first shot was fired. To understand what happened inside the Dennis M. Lynch Arena on that Monday afternoon, you have to go back 5 years. Back to February 2020. Back to a courthouse, a filing, and a single document that set in motion a chain of events that would end, 5 years later, with gunfire echoing through a hockey rink while children scrambled for their lives. In February 2020, a woman named Rhonda Dorgan walked into a courthouse and filed for divorce from her husband of many years, Robert Dorgan. The filing itself was not unusual. Marriages end every day. People fall apart, grow apart, discover that the person they built a life with is no longer, or perhaps never was, the person they believed them to be. Divorce is painful, but it is common. It is survivable. It is, in most cases, the beginning of something new rather than the end of everything. But the grounds that Rhonda Dorgan initially wrote on that petition were not common. She wrote, in her own hand, on an official court document, gender reassignment surgery, narcissistic personality disorder traits. Those words were later crossed out, replaced with the more legally standard phrase, irreconcilable differences. Whether that change was made on legal advice, or out of sensitivity, or for reasons that only Rhonda and her attorney fully understood, we cannot say with certainty. But the original words were there, written, filed, as part of the public record of a marriage that had reached a point of no return. And they tell us something important about the world inside that marriage, about the complexity and the pain and the irreconcilable distance that had opened up between 2 people who had once chosen each other. Robert Dorgan, the person Rhonda was divorcing, had been living a life of profound internal conflict for years, a life that those who knew him described as split, fractured, caught between 2 identities that pulled in opposite directions with a force that neither could fully resolve. At work, at the naval contracting facility of General Dynamics Bath Iron Works in Bath, Maine, colleagues knew Dorgan as Roberta. She used the women's bathroom. She talked about her family. She had a temper, a bad one, to the kind that sometimes erupted into screaming matches with co-workers that left the room unsettled long after the noise had stopped. But that same co-worker who described the temper also described something else, something more complicated. They said Dorgan appeared to be split on the issue of transgender acceptance. One moment proud of transitioning, the next embarrassed by it. Vacillating, uncertain, caught in a place that had no comfortable resolution. That internal fracture, that inability to find stable ground inside an identity that the outside world was only beginning to understand how to engage with, is not, by itself, an explanation for what happened on that Monday afternoon. It is important to say that clearly and without ambiguity. The overwhelming majority of people navigating gender transition, the overwhelming majority of people living with the complexity and the courage that transition requires, do not become violent. They do not carry guns into hockey arenas. They do not kill the people they once loved. What it is context. Context for understanding a human being who was, by every account, deeply and chronically at war with themselves. And a person at war with themselves who has no stable ground to stand on internally, who is watching their marriage dissolve and their family fracture, and their identity remain unresolved. That person is carrying a weight that most of us will never fully understand. The question that investigators would later have to grapple with is what that weight eventually became. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because in February 2020, the same month that Rhonda filed for divorce, Robert Dorgan walked into a police station and filed a report of his own. The report alleged that Rhonda's father, his father-in-law, had threatened to have Dorgan killed. The allegation was specific. Dorgan claimed the father-in-law had used a derogatory term for transgender people and had made a direct threat against Dorgan's life. Police took the report seriously enough to file a criminal charge against the father-in-law. That charge was later dismissed. But the fact of it, the filing, the allegation, the claim that the man who would one day be among the shooting victims had once allegedly threatened to have Dorgan killed, adds a layer to this story that is impossible to ignore. There was history here. Real, documented, bitter history. Not just the ordinary grief of a marriage ending, but something sharper than that. Says something with edges. A divorce petition that named gender and personality as grounds. A counter-allegation of a death threat. A criminal charge filed and then dismissed. Two people and two families caught in the wreckage of a relationship that had become something far more hostile than sad. And in the middle of all of it, a young man named Aidan. Aidan Dorgan, Robert and Rhonda's adult son, a hockey player. The kind of son whose athletic life his parent followed closely enough that colleagues at work knew about it. Destiny McKenzie, a co-worker at Bath Iron Works who remembered Dorgan often going by Roberta, recalled that hockey came up regularly in conversation, that Dorgan talked about a hockey-playing son. That family, in some form, was present in the daily texture of Dorgan's working life, which makes what happened to Aidan all the more devastating to absorb. Because in the end, the person who killed Aidan Dorgan was the parent who had spoken about him at work, who had sat in those stands before. Pawtucket Police Chief Tina Goncalves confirmed that Dorgan had attended many hockey games previously, without incident, who had presumably, at some point in Aidan's life, cheered for him from those same bleachers where the shooting would eventually take place. That detail, that Dorgan had been to many games before without incident, is one of the most chilling aspects of the entire case. Because it means the arena was not an unfamiliar location chosen at random. It was known, familiar, a place Dorgan had been before, had navigated before, or had sat in before, surrounded by the same families and the same noise and the same atmosphere of a youth hockey game in Rhode Island. The choice of that location was not accidental. It was deliberate. Now cast your mind back to that Monday afternoon, to the moment before anyone in that arena had any reason to be afraid. The game was underway. Players were on the ice. Young people, some of them perhaps in the final games of their senior season, playing with the particular intensity of athletes who understand that every game might be their last, in a uniform they have worn for years. Parents were in the stands. Coaches were behind the benches. The ordinary, loud, communal atmosphere of a youth sporting event was fully in effect. Robert Dorgan was there, wearing female clothing, according to investigators who reviewed the scene, carrying 2 firearms, a Glock 10mm pistol, and a Sig Sauer P226, both legally owned, both loaded. Both brought into that arena with a purpose that nobody around Dorgan, in those final ordinary minutes before everything changed, had any way of detecting. Police Chief Goncalves confirmed that there was no indication, none, that violence was coming. No confrontation, no argument observed by witnesses before the shooting began. No raised voices, no visible altercation, no moment that any of the nearly 100 witnesses who would later speak to investigators could point to and say, "That was when I knew something was wrong." There was nothing. And then there was everything. The shots, when they came, were not immediately recognized for what they were. Melissa Dunn, whose son was playing in the game that afternoon, I described hearing loud noises and thinking at first that it was kids banging on the boards with their skates. That is how ordinary the first sounds of the violence seemed. That is how completely unprepared the human brain is to identify gunfire in a place where gunfire has no business being. And then the screaming started. Players on the ice, young athletes who had been focused entirely on the game, on the puck, on the movements of their teammates and opponents, suddenly found themselves in a situation for which no amount of athletic training prepares anyone. The video, which was being live-streamed on a platform called Live Barn at the moment the shooting began, captured the chaos in real time. Players on the benches diving for cover. Players on the ice skating frantically toward exits. So blades cutting desperate lines across the rink as they scrambled to get away from sounds they didn't yet fully understand, but instinctively knew meant danger. Fans fled their seats. Parents screamed names. The arena, which moments before had been full of the uncomplicated noise of sport and community, and an ordinary Monday afternoon, became something unrecognizable. Rhonda Dorgan was shot. Aidan Dorgan was shot. And in the stands, amid the chaos and the fleeing and the screaming, something extraordinary happened. Something that, in the middle of an event defined entirely by one person's decision to destroy, stands as evidence that human beings are also capable of the opposite. A bystander stepped forward. An ordinary person, unnamed, unannounced, and carrying none of the equipment or training or official authority that we typically associate with the act of stopping a shooter, stepped into the chaos and intervened. 3 bystanders, police would later clarify, were ultimately able to contain Dorgan, to physically restrain a person who was armed and dangerous and who had already fired shots that killed 2 people. But even contained, even physically held, Dorgan managed to reach a second firearm, and used it one final time, on himself. By the time the arena was secured, by the time law enforcement flooded through the doors and began the grim work of understanding what had just happened in a hockey rink in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, 2 people were dead. 3 more were fighting for their lives in hospital. And an entire community, parents, children, coaches, so families, had been permanently marked by something they had witnessed in a place where the worst thing that was supposed to happen was a lost game. Outside the arena, Michael Stephen, who had recorded video in the aftermath, stood in front of cameras and said something simple and true and unbearable. "It happens far too often in our nation," he said. He was not wrong. But inside the specific tragedy of that Monday afternoon, beyond the national conversation about gun laws and public safety that would inevitably follow, there was a story that was more personal than any of that. A story about a family, about a marriage that ended badly, about a divorce filing with words that were written and then crossed out, about a son who played hockey and a parent who came to watch. Want about 5 years of unresolved anger that walked into an arena one afternoon and didn't walk back out. 5 years is a long time to carry something. 5 years is long enough for anger to stop feeling like anger and start feeling like something else entirely. Something quieter. Something that settles into the bones and becomes part of the architecture of a person's daily life. Not a fire that burns visibly, but an ember that never quite goes out. That stays lit in the dark, in the quiet moments, in the space between what a person shows the world and what they carry alone. Robert Dorgan had been carrying something for 5 years. From the moment Rhonda filed that divorce petition in February 2020, with those original words written in her own hand, the words that spoke to the deepest and most personal dimensions of who Robert Dorgan was and how that identity had fractured their marriage. Something shifted. Something that had perhaps been fragile for much longer than 5 years finally broke in a way that could not be repaired. We do not know exactly what the years between 2020 and that Monday afternoon looked like inside Robert Dorgan's private world. We do not have access to the conversations that were not recorded, the nights that left no trace in any public document, the slow accumulation of grievance and loss and unresolved pain that builds in the aftermath of a marriage's collapse. What we have is the outline, the edges of a picture that, when you look at them carefully, tell you something about the shape of what was inside. And the divorce itself was contentious in ways that went beyond the ordinary difficulty of a marriage ending. The original grounds Rhonda cited, gender reassignment surgery and narcissistic personality disorder traits, were not the words of a woman simply citing incompatibility. They were the words of a woman pointing directly at the fault lines of the relationship, at the specific and deeply personal territory that had made the marriage impossible to sustain. Whatever conversations had happened privately between Robert and Rhonda in the years leading up to that filing, the document itself made clear that the breakdown was rooted in something fundamental, something that touched the core of who Robert Dorgan was, or was becoming, and how that transformation had affected the family built around it. Those words were later crossed out. I replaced with irreconcilable differences, a phrase so standard and so deliberately vague that it tells you almost nothing. But you cannot unwrite what was written first. The original words existed. They were seen. And for Robert Dorgan, a person already navigating the profound instability of an unresolved gender identity, already caught between pride and embarrassment, in the words of a coworker who knew them well, those words, written by the person who had chosen them above everyone else, must have landed with a particular and devastating weight. And then came the counter-allegation. The same month Rhonda filed for divorce, Robert Dorgan walked into a police station and reported that Rhonda's father had threatened to have Dorgan killed, had used a derogatory term for transgender people, had made a threat so serious that Dorgan felt compelled to document it officially, to put it on record, to ask law enforcement to intervene. A criminal charge was filed against the father-in-law. It was later dismissed. But sit with the landscape of that moment for a second. A divorce petition citing gender transition as grounds, a counter-allegation of a death threat from the father-in-law, a criminal charge that went nowhere. Two families, already bound together by years of shared history, and a son named Aiden who existed at the center of all of it, now formally adversarial, now documented, now on opposite sides of a legal process that would determine the terms of a future they would all have to live inside. That is the world Robert Dorgan was inhabiting in February 2020. And that world did not get easier in the years that followed. With the internal conflict that colleagues at Bath Iron Works described, The vacillation between pride and embarrassment about transitioning, the bad temper that sometimes erupted without warning, the screaming matches that unsettled the workplace, speaks to a person who had not found peace, who was, despite the years that had passed since the divorce filing, still caught in the same unresolved storm, still split between identities, still carrying the weight of a life that had not landed anywhere stable. Destiny Mackenzie, the co-worker who remembered Dorgan as Roberta, remembered something else, too. She remembered that hockey came up often, that the hockey-playing son was a regular topic of conversation. That in the midst of everything, the identity conflict, the workplace tensions, but the aftermath of a bitter divorce, there was still this thread connecting Robert Dorgan to the family that had come apart. The son, Aiden. And here is where the story becomes not just tragic, but genuinely heartbreaking in a way that resists easy categorization. Because Aiden Dorgan was not a stranger to his parent. He was not someone Robert Dorgan had lost contact with, had been cut off from, had been legally prevented from seeing. He was present enough in Robert Dorgan's life that colleagues heard about him regularly, that his hockey games were something Robert Dorgan attended, not once, not as an exceptional occasion, but repeatedly. Chief Goncalves confirmed it explicitly. Dorgan had been to many games before without incident, which raises a question that has no comfortable answer. What changed? What happened in the weeks or months or days before that Monday that turned a parent who had sat in those stands before, who had watched their son play hockey in that arena before, into someone who walked through those same doors carrying 2 loaded firearms? Investigators combed through thousands of Robert Dorgan's social media posts in the aftermath of the shooting, looking for the answer to exactly that question. Looking for the thread, the post, the comment, the documented expression of intent or escalating anger. That might explain the timeline. That might show when the decision was made, or when the planning began, or when whatever final threshold was crossed got crossed. We do not yet know what they found. What we know is that there was no visible confrontation on the day itself, no argument observed by witnesses, no raised voices, no altercation, no moment that any of the nearly 100 people in that arena could point to as a warning. Chief Goncalves was explicit about this. There was no indication, she said, that violence was coming. Dorgan arrived. The game was in progress. And then the shooting began. Sudden, targeted, and without any observable preceding conflict. This is the part of the story that haunts investigators in cases like this. The absence of a visible trigger does not mean there was no trigger. It means the trigger was internal, private, carried in the silence of a person's own mind, invisible to everyone around them, right up until the moment it was not. 2 legally owned firearms, a Glock 10mm pistol, and a Sig Sauer P226, brought into the arena deliberately, both loaded, both used. Yet the legal ownership of those weapons adds its own layer to a story that was already complicated enough, because it means that at no point in the chain of events leading up to that Monday did the existence of those guns constitute a red flag that any system was equipped to see and act on. They were registered. They were legal. They were, by every formal measure, exactly what they were supposed to be. Until they weren't. Rhonda Dorgan never had the chance to run. Aiden Dorgan, the young man whose hockey games his parent had attended so many times in this very arena without incident, never had the chance to understand what was happening before it was over. The shooting unfolded in the middle of a live youth hockey game, on a platform called Live Barn, which streams youth sporting events for families and friends who cannot attend in person. The entire incident was captured in real time. The video, which LiveBarn subsequently warned people not to share without permission, showed the moment the ordinary world of a hockey game became something else entirely. Players on the benches dropping to the floor. Players on the ice skating hard and fast toward whatever exit was closest. The instinct to move overriding everything else. Fans abandoning their seats. The sound of shots that some people, in the first fraction of a second, mistook for the familiar noise of a hockey rink. Melissa Dunn was in that arena. Her son was on the ice. She heard the sounds and thought, at first, that it was kids banging on the boards with their skates. And that is how the human brain works in a moment it has no framework for. It reaches for the most familiar explanation, the most ordinary interpretation, the one that keeps the world recognizable for one more second before the truth arrives. And then it arrived. She screamed for her son to duck. She ran out of the rink. And then, because she is a mother, and her son was somewhere inside, she ran back in, back through the doors of an active shooting scene, back into a hockey arena where people were still in motion, still panicking, still trying to understand what was happening. She found paramedics performing CPR in the stands. That image, a mother running back into danger to find her child, and finding instead the evidence of someone else's child being fought for on the bleachers of a hockey rink, is the image that perhaps captures the full horror of that Monday afternoon more completely than any statistic or timeline or investigative detail ever could. Outside, Michael Stevens stood with his camera and said what many people were feeling. It happens far too often in our nation. And then, in the middle of the chaos and the panic, and the sounds of people trying to survive something they had no preparation for, something happened that this story cannot end without honoring fully. A stranger stepped forward, not a police officer, not a security guard, not someone with a badge or a weapon or any official authority to intervene. An ordinary person, a bystander, unnamed, unannounced, who looked at what was happening and made a decision in real time that most people in that moment would not have been able to make, who stepped into the space between a shooter and more potential victims and did something. 3 bystanders ultimately worked together to physically contain Robert Dorgan, to hold a person who had already killed 2 people and wounded 3 more, to put their own bodies between the shooter and everyone else still in that arena. It was not clean. It was not safe. Even contained, even physically restrained by 3 people, Dorgan managed to reach a second firearm. Managed, in the final moments, to get a hand on the Sig Sauer P226 that had been brought into the arena alongside the Glock. But that second firearm was turned inward. Robert Dorgan died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And in the sudden, terrible quiet that followed, in the arena that was still full of the echo of everything that had just happened, the full weight of the afternoon began to settle. 2 dead. Rhonda Dorgan, Aidan Dorgan, a woman who had filed for divorce 5 years ago, and a young man who had simply been playing hockey. 3 more in critical condition at hospital. Rhonda's mother and father, who had once allegedly been at the center of a counter-allegation that led to a criminal charge, and a family friend who had come to watch a game and left in an ambulance. Rhode Island Governor Dan McKee spoke for a state that was still raw from the Brown University shooting just 2 months earlier. "Our state is grieving again," he said. And it was. But grief, in cases like this, is never just grief. It is always also a question. And the same question that follows every public act of mass violence in America, that rises in the aftermath of every shooting in every school and church and arena and ordinary public space where people gathered to do ordinary things and found themselves instead in the middle of something they will spend the rest of their lives trying to process. How do we stop this from happening again? The answer to that question is not simple. It never is. It involves conversations about gun laws. Destiny McKenzie, the co-worker, said plainly that the reality of gun laws needs major reconsideration. It involves conversations about mental health and identity, and the support systems, or lack of them, available to people navigating the kind of profound internal conflict that Robert Dorgan appeared to be living with for years. And it involves conversations about the warning signs that exist in hindsight and the systems that might catch them in real time before 2 people are dead in a hockey rink and 3 more are fighting for their lives. None of those conversations are easy. None of them produce fast answers. And none of them bring back Rhonda Dorgan or Aidan Dorgan or give back to the families in that arena the version of that Monday afternoon where they went home the same people they were when they arrived. That version is gone. What remains is the family statement posted to an online fundraiser in the days after the shooting. A statement written by people who were still in the middle of the worst experience of their lives, who were still sitting in hospital waiting rooms hoping that Rhonda's parents would survive, who were still trying to find language for something that resists language entirely. Our family, they wrote, has been forever changed by the tragic events at Lynch Arena. Forever changed. 2 words that contain everything. The before and the after. The Monday morning that existed before the game and the Monday night that existed after it. The world in which Rhonda Dorgan was alive and Aidan Dorgan was playing hockey and the grandparents were in the stands cheering. And the world that began the moment the first shot was fired and has not stopped being the world they live in since. Aidan Dorgan deserved to finish that game. Rhonda Dorgan deserved to watch him. The grandparents in that arena deserved to go home that evening with nothing more serious than cold feet and a hoarse voice from cheering. They deserved ordinary. And ordinary was taken from them in a matter of minutes, in an arena in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, on a Monday afternoon that started like any other Monday afternoon and ended in a way that no afternoon ever should. There are people in that community who will never fully recover from what they saw. Children who were on that ice, young athletes who dove behind benches and skated desperately for exits, who will carry the memory of that afternoon in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Parents who ran out of an arena screaming their children's names and then ran back in because the alternative, not knowing, was worse than the danger. They deserve to be seen too, not just as witnesses, not just as sources in an investigation or voices in a news segment, as people, as a community that was sitting together on an ordinary Monday and bound by the simple and beautiful ritual of watching young people play a sport they love, and was changed permanently by something none of them asked for and none of them deserved. Rhode Island was grieving. And somewhere in that grief, in the space between the questions that have answers and the questions that don't, between the policy debates and the investigation and the thousands of social media posts that investigators were still combing through, there were just people. Rhonda, Aidan, a family forever changed, a community that will never look at a hockey arena the same way again, and an unnamed stranger who stepped forward when everyone else was running. That stranger deserves the last word in this story. Not because their act of courage cancels out the horror of what happened. It does not, and nothing will. But because in a story defined by one person's choice to destroy, the choice of someone else to step forward and risk everything to stop it is the most human thing in it. They saw what was happening. They chose not to look away. And because of that choice, The list of people who did not come home that Monday is not longer than it already is. That matters. It will always matter. Rest in peace, Rhonda Dorgan. Rest in peace, Aidan Dorgan. Your story deserved a different ending.